guys. My greetings to everyone. Hello, sir. My name is Nadia Yakumusa. I'm a student at Chakra Karatakan University. I am a first year master degree student and I'm studying at the Department of Political Science and International Relations. Today I'm going to present my final exams graduation homework of the first trimester of the International Relations course. Today I'm going to explain one of my professor's article, which titled as "The Cold War Revisited: Explaining and Understanding of the End of Cold War in Light of Neo-Realism," as you can see in here in title. First, we are going to see the Cold War, definite the Cold War, and we're going to see the main question of this article. The Cold War, a decades-long geopolitical standoff between the United States and Soviet Union, dominated international relations in the latter half of the 20th century, rooted in ideological, political, and economic rivalry. It shaped alliance, conflicts, and policies worldwide. However, its unexpected end in the late 20th century, marked by the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the peaceful transformation of the global order, sparked intense intellectual debate. One such debate revolves around the role of realism and its derivative Neo-Realism in understanding and predicting this systematic change. Critics argue that these theories, which emphasize power dynamics and state behavior, fail to foresee the Cold War's peaceful conclusion. Neo-realists counter that this singular transformative event is insufficient to disprove their framework, as it represents an anomaly rather than a definitive test of their theory. Understanding Neo-realism's predictive limitation and strength require a nuanced evaluation of its principles, particularly in the context of systematic change that led to the Cold War's end. The central question of this article is whether Neo-realism, a dominant theory in international relations, can adequately explain the end of the Cold War. Neo-realism, also known as structural realism, focuses on the anarchic nature of the international system, the centrality of states as primary actors, and the importance of the distribution of capabilities among these states. Kenneth Walls, a leading proponent of Neo-realism, argues that systematic level factors rather than unit level characteristics such as domestic politics or individual decisions are the principal drivers of international outcomes. This theoretical framework has faced criticism for its apparent inability to account for the peaceful conclusion of the Cold War and subsequent systematic transformation. Next, we're going to see the Neo-realism's core tenets. Neo-realism is built on three foundation principles. The first one, the international system is inherently anarchic, lacking a central authority to govern state interaction. States are the main actors in this system. Lacking a central authority to govern state interaction. Second, states are the main actors in this system, each pursuing survival and security end. Third, the distribution of capabilities among states is a critical determinant of their behavior and the system structure. Wall's theory emphasized the structural level of analysis, which examines how the configuration of power among states influence outcomes, sidelining domestic and individual level factors. Neo-realism posits that change in the distribution of capabilities, such as shifts in military or economic power, are the primary drivers of systematic change. However, critics argue that this focus on structure at the expense of unit level dynamics limits Neo-realism's ability to explain unexpected events like the peaceful end of the Cold War. Here, a more detailed explanation of the Neo-realism core tenets. Anarchical international system. In Neo-realism, the international system is fundamentally anarchic, meaning there is no overarching authority above states. This lack of central governance distinguishes the international realm from domestic political systems, which are hierarchical and governed by enforceable rules. In an anarchic system, states operate in a self-help environment where survival is the primary goal. Consequently, states are constantly vigilant about their relative power compared to others, as no external entity guarantees their security. The anarchic nature of the system leads to power competition and often limits cooperation among states. State-centric approach. Neorealism posits that states are the primary actor in international politics. These sovereign entities act rationally to maximize their interest, primarily security and power. The theory disregards the influence of non-state actors such as international organizations, multinational corporations, or transnational networks. Kenneth Walls, a leading figure in neorealism, emphasized that while states differ in attributes such as governance or ideology, their behavior in the international system is shaped more by the system's structural constraint than by internal characteristics. Distribution of capabilities as the key variable. This distribution of capabilities, particularly military and economic power, determine the structure of the international system in neorealism. Walls distinguishes between bipolar, two dominant powers, as during the Cold War, and multipolar, several major powers systems, asserting that the distribution of power influences state behavior and the likelihood of conflict or stability. The theory asserts that shift in the balance of power can lead to systematic changes such as alliance or conflicts as states adapt to maintain their positions in the system. Walls three levels of analysis: individual, domestic, international. Walls introduced levels of analysis to explain international outcomes. Individual level. Focus on the action and decision of leaders or specific individuals. This level examines how personal beliefs, perceptions, and decisions influence international politics. Domestic level considers internal factors within states such as government system, economic structure, or societal pressure that affect foreign policy. International level emphasized the anarchic structure of the international system and the distribution of power among states. Walls prioritized this level, arguing that the international structure constraint state behavior more significantly than individual or domestic factors. Neorealism predictive failure. Central critic. Here are some critiques of the failure to predict the Cold War's end. Neorealism, as an extension of classical realism, posits that the structure of the international system, defined by anarchy and the distribution of capabilities among states, is the primary determinant of global political outcomes. However, the end of the Cold War posed a significant challenge to neorealism: the peaceful dissolution of the Soviet Union, the withdrawal from Eastern Europe, and the lack of major systematic conflict contradicted two more neorealist assumptions: that states prioritized survival at all costs and that systemic changes are driven solely by shifts in relative capabilities. The theory's inability to foresee or adequately explain these developments revealed limitation in its analytic framework. Neorealists argue that the end of the Cold War represented a unique and unprecedented transformation, which they dismiss as a single data point rather than a definitive refutation of their paradigm. This maintained that neorealism is designed to identify enduring partners in international politics rather than predict specific events. This response highlights attention within the field of international relations theory should the predictive power of a theory be a litmus test for its validity. Critics contend that the inability to foresee a transformation of such magnetic undermines the theory's explanatory power, whilst supporters argue that a theory's utility lies in its ability to afford insight into systemic regularities rather than specific forecasts. The debate on predictive power in international relation theory. The debate over whether predictive power is essential to a robust theory of international relations underscores differing expectations about the purpose of theoretical model. For neorealists like Kenneth Walls, theories are abstraction meant to simplify complex reality and identify structural forces that shape state behavior. They argue that theories should be evaluated based on their ability to afford generalizable insight, not on their capacity to predict singular events. Walls emphasize that international outcomes result from systematic constraint, which means that neorealism prioritizes understanding the enduring principles of an anarchic international system over the cases of individual state action or unique historical moment. Conversely, critics of neorealism assert that a theory of international relations must possess some degree of predictive accuracy to remain relevant. They argued that the peaceful end of the Cold War, facilitated by domestic political change within the Soviet Union and cooperative strategies from the Western powers, exposed the inadequacy of focusing solely on systemic factors. Critics advocate for more interrogative approaches that combine structural analysis with domestic and individual level consideration, thus broadening the scope of inquiry to account for the interplay of various factors that influence systematic change. Reassessing neorealism in light of predictive failure. Neorealism's predictive failure regarding the Cold War has prompted scholars to reassess its theoretical foundation. While neorealism excels at explaining the persistence of power politics and the impact of systemic constraint, it struggled with dynamic transformation driven by domestic reforms, ideological shifts, or transnational influences. The theories focus on structural determinant at the expense of unit-level individual factor limitation, its ability to account for non-systemic catalysts of change. This reassessment has fueled the evaluation of alternative paradigms such as neoliberal institutionalism and constructivism, which seek to address the blind spot in the neorealist theory by incorporating broader explanatory variable into their analysis. Structural against unit level analysis. Neorealism, as articulated by Kenneth Walls, emphasized the international system structure, particularly the anarchic nature of the system and the distribution of capabilities among states. Walls argued that system level factors rather than domestic or individual level dynamics primarily determine state behavior. This perspective prioritizes abstraction, aiming to create a generalized theory of international politics. Critics, however, challenge this structural emphasis, arguing that it inadequately explains significant historical events, particularly the peaceful resolution of the Cold War. They contend that unit level factors such as leadership decision, domestic political pressure, and ideological change often play decisive roles in shaping outcomes. Reductionists who focus on unit level analysis argue that such factors are essential to understanding the cases of international relations. Ozceli's critique and argument for unit level inclusion. Ozceli critiques Neo-Realism for neglecting the role of domestic and individual level factors in systematic change. He points out that while Waltz acknowledged the potential influence of unit level causes, his theoretical framework heavily prioritized structural determinants, sidelining key dynamics within states and their leadership. Ozceli argues that the end of the Cold War cannot be fully understood through neo-realist assumptions alone. He emphasized the need to account for domestic pressures, ideological shifts, and the role of individual leaders like Mikhail Gorbachev by incorporating these factors. Ozceli suggests that we can better understand how systemic transformation acquire and avoid oversimplified explanation based on solely on power distribution. Examples: Gorbachev's reform and internal Soviet pressure. Mikhail Gorbachev's leadership introduced profound change to Soviet domestic and foreign policy through initiatives like glasnost, openness, and perestroika. This reform aimed to address internal economic stagnation and political inefficiencies. Gorbachev's decision to reduce the Soviet Union's involvement in Eastern Europe, culminating in the withdrawal of troops and the fall of Berlin Wall, was a pivotal moment. These actions were influenced by his ideological commitment to reducing Cold War tension and improving relations with the West, factor that cannot be explained solely by change in the distribution of capabilities. Internal Soviet pressure. Domestic economic challenges such as declining industrial productivity, rising defense expenditures, and technological stagnation created significant pressure for reform. Popular discontent and increasing demands for political liberalization within the Soviet Union further strained the regime, forcing leaders to pursue transformative policies. Neo-realist expectation and rationality. Neo-realism, rooted in Kenneth Walls' theory of international politics, emphasized structural factors in international relations, the anarchic nature of the international system, states as the primary actors, the distribution of capabilities among states determining outcomes. In this framework, states prioritize survival by examining relative power, often leading to competition alliances and balancing behaviors. A state's foreign policy, according to neo-realism, should aim to secure its position in the global hierarchy of power. Soviet action and the challenge to rationality. Withdrawal from Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union's decision to withdraw troops from Eastern Europe and effectively allow its satellite states to pursue independent policies is inconsistent with neorealism. Maintaining control over Eastern Europe was critical to Soviet power projection and security. Neorealist logic would expect the USSR to defend these territories aggressively in using force if necessary to preserve its sphere of influence, accommodation with the West. Soviet leadership, particularly under Mikhail Gorbachev, adopted policies of detent and engagement with the West. Initiatives like arms reduction treaties and reduced confrontation contradicted, and the neorealist notion that the great powers always seek to maximize their relative advantage over rivals. Absence of systematic wars. A fundamental assumption of neorealists is the major structural change in the international system often acquired through war, as seen in the World Wars. However, the Cold War ended peacefully with the Soviet Union declining in power and influence without resorting to systemic conflict. This outcome contradicts the expectation that states prioritize survival through power balancing strategies, even at the risk of war. Implication. Implication for neorealists. The Soviet Union's unexpected action highlights key limitation of neorealism, overemphasize on systemic factors at the expense of domestic and individual level analysis, inability to account for non-rational decisions driven by ideology, domestic politics, or leadership preference, failure to predict or explain peaceful systemic change such as the end of the Cold War by focusing exclusively on the structural dynamics of power distribution. Neorealism struggles to explain anomalies like the Soviet Union's retreat from Eastern Europe and accommodation with the West. This development suggests the need for a more integrative approach that considers multiple levels of analysis, including domestic and individual factors, to understand international relations comprehensively. Alternative explanation and critics. Critics argue that the Soviet Union's action reflects domestic and individual level factors which neorealism overlooks: domestic pressure, economic stagnation, technological backwardness, and unsustainable military expenditures significantly influenced Soviet policy. The internal decay of the Soviet economy, and the rising demand for political reform rendered continued confrontation with the West impossible. Individual leadership. Mikhail Gorbachev's role was pivotal. His reformist agenda, encapsulated in policies like glasnost and perestroika, prioritized internal reform and international cooperative over traditional power maximizing behaviors. Neorealist argument of relative decline. Neorealism, a structural realist theory, argues that the transformation of the international system results primarily from change in the distribution of capabilities among states. Specifically, neorealists posit that the relative decline in a state's power, its military, economic, and technological capabilities compared to other states directly affects its foreign, foreign policy and behaviors in the international system. In the context of the Cold War, Neo-Realists argued that the Soviet Union's relative decline was a significant factor in systematic change. They assert the USSR faced economic stagnation, technological backwardness, and unsustainable defense expenditures. These issues weakened the Soviet position relative to United States, compelling the USSR to modify its foreign policies, including withdrawing from Eastern Europe and pursuing detente with the West. The relative decline theory is central to neo-realist explanation to the Soviet Union's behavior and the broader transformation of the international system that marked the end of the Cold War. Neo-realists also emphasized the role of the international structure anarchic and defined by the distribution of power over unit-level factors like domestic politics or individual leaders. This focus on systemic factors assumes that systemic constraint, not internal characteristic, drive state behavior. Ozcelik's critic Cesar Ozcelik challenged the neo-realist explanation of relative decline, arguing that it is insufficient and overlooks crucial factors that influenced the end of the Cold War and the Soviet Union's transformation. Key points of Ozcelik's critique include oversimplification. First, oversimplification of systemic change. Realism overemphasize structural factors such as relative power decline while neglecting unit-level dynamics like domestic politics, ideological shifts, and leadership choices. Ozcelik argues that systemic change cannot be explained solely by shifts in relative power. Other factors, including the internal reforms and societal pressures within the USSR, played significant roles. Failure to account for non-structural factors. Neo-realism underestimates the importance of Gorbachev's policies, which reflected ideological shift and domestic challenge rather than purely structural pressures. Domestic factors such as economic crisis, nationalist movements, and public discontent were critical in shaping Soviet foreign policy and the eventual dissolution of the USSR. 4. Mismatch with historical events. The Soviet Union's actions, such as its peaceful withdrawal from Eastern Europe and the absence of war during the transition, contradict the neo-realist assumption that states prioritize survival and power retention at all costs. Neo-realist prediction failed to account for the USSR's cooperative and non-aggressive approach during its decline, as these behaviors divide from the self-help principles of realism. Reliance on relative decline as a cause. Ozcelik notes that relative decline argued lacks empirical support, as it is difficult to quantify or prove direct causal link between the Soviet Union's declining capabilities and its policy changes. The peaceful transformation of the international system suggests that other mechanisms such as international norms, institutional arrangements, and interdependence also influence outcomes. The end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War was primarily driven by internal factors within the Soviet Union, particularly under Mikhail Gorbachev's leadership. His reform, perestroika, and glasnost addressed the Soviet Union's economic stagnation, systemic inefficiencies, and legitimacy crisis, which undermined public trust domestically and Eastern Europe. This domestic pressure compelled a a reorientation of Soviet foreign policy, leading to reduce military expenditures, with withdrawal from Eastern Europe and arms control agreements with the West. Neo-Realism, with its focus on systemic factors and the distribution of power, failed to explain these developments as the Cold War ended despite the continued military parity between the superpowers. Instead, Gorbachev's recognition of internal crisis and his new thinking in foreign policy were decisive in reshaping global dynamics, highlighting the critical role of domestic politics and individual leadership in driving systemic transformation. Conclusion. To sum up, Cesar Ozceli argues that neorealism must incorporate unit level analysis, domestic factors, and individual action to better explain the Cold War's end. He critiques neorealism overemphasize on systematic level explanations such as the distribution of capabilities which left it unable to anticipate peaceful change like the Soviet Union's internal restructuring and voluntary retreat from Eastern Europe. Despite Kenneth Walls' assertion that neorealism is a theory for understanding patterns rather than specific prediction, the Cold War's peaceful resolution exposed its lack of a theory for peaceful change. Ozceli calls for a broader analytic approach that integrates domestic and individual level factors alongside systemic structure to address significant geopolitical transformation. Future research could explore alternative theoretical frameworks such as institutionalism or constructivism to address neorealism's gaps and better explain transformative events in international relations. That was all, my friends. Thank you for listening and for your time.